Hey, guys, tonight we drift out onto the water together and let your mind slip from bright screen light into soft ocean dark while we talk about how people once crossed dangerous seas with nothing more than wood woo and a stubborn sense of direction. Imagine setting sail across a vast, uncharted ocean with no compass, no GPS, just the open sea stretching before you. Sounds impossible, right? But that's exactly what the Vikings did, mastering navigation in a way that still baffles modern scientists. How did they conquer the high seas without getting hopelessly lost? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you are in the world and what time it is for you right now, so we can imagine this sleepy voyage happening across a whole patchwork of glowing bedroom windows. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself on a narrow wooden pier breath, misting in the cold evening air. The sky above is a deep blue that has almost given up being day. Ahead, a long, low ship waits, its dragon-headed prow rising just enough to look serious without becoming ridiculous. Lanterns sway along the rail flames, shivering in the breeze and painting the planks in small puddles of gold. You step on board and feel the hull flex gently under your feet. The sea below does not crash in giant heroic waves. It simply heaves and sighs like a sleepy animal you're about to climb onto. The oars rest inside the rails. For the moment, the longship waits, pointed toward the darker water beyond the harbor mouth, while crew members move in quiet patterns, checking ropes, straightening shields, and tucking loose gear under benches so nothing rattles or escapes into the night. You slide along the central walkway and settle onto a smooth bench. The wood is cold through your clothes, but furs and cloaks lie folded within easy reach. Someone nudges a bundle of thick wool toward your hands and gives your bare fingers a look of gentle pity, as if you have arrived at a snowstorm in beachwear. Tied to the nearest rib of the ship, you notice a tiny, carved wooden face, a pocket-sized guardian with one eye, slightly larger than the other. Little charms like that ride along, often not because they tame the sea, but because they calm the humans who have to sit on it. Behind you, the harbor glows with scattered points of fire that mark homes, halls, and sheds, waiting for some future repair day. As the ship eases away from the pier, those dots gather into a small cluster and then begin to shrink. You feel the first deep pull of the oars. The rhythm settles into your chest, slow and steady like a big borrowed heartbeat. Water brushes the hull in soft repeating sounds, just loud enough to keep you company without demanding attention. The steering oar creaks as the helmsman nudges the ship toward the mouth of the fjord. Dark rock rises on either side, its outline only just visible against a strip of fading light. The sun has dropped below the horizon, but its memory lingers in a pale band that wraps the edge of the sky. Even here, with land still close, the person guiding this ship is already watching that fading glow and feeling the air, quietly judging how the season, the wind, and the light will treat this voyage. In this world, seasons decide who travels and who stays home. In kinder months, these waters carry traffic between farms' markets and distant settlements. In rough seasons, the route empties. People quickly learn which stretches of sea can be trusted and when, because mistakes here do not end with a simple change fee and a polite message from an airline. Yet, Viking crews still manage to cross from Norway to Iceland, to Greenland, and even to the shores of North America, so whatever system they use to guide these hulls clearly works with impressive reliability. Historians still argue whether navigation knowledge in this society comes from a unified formal method that every experienced captain learns, or whether each region builds its own blend of tricks, stories, and habits passed along in talk, rather than in tidy books. What you feel on this deck is less like a classroom and more like a floating memory bank where each sailor carries fragments of experience and the whole crew stitches them together into a path that can face the dark water ahead. The fjord widens and then slips away behind you. The protective arms of rock fall back and the sea in front stretches out like a blank, dark sheet. There are no blinking buoys, no metal towers, no friendly strip of city glow along the horizon. The marks here are subtle. A faint shimmer of starlight on the surface, that ghost of pale light still clinging to the edge of the sky, the hint of a headland that will vanish when full night settles. Somewhere behind a gull calls once in a tone that sounds suspiciously like disapproval. You feel a tightening in your chest. Excitement sits beside unease, both wrapped in the quiet thought that this space is very large and you are very small. To cross it without compass or chart is not only a practical skill, it is a mental posture. You have to trust patterns you can never see all at once. The people around you have grown up with those patterns, so for them this step into open-looking sea is serious but not strange. A crew member passes and nudges a loose coil of rope back into a tidy loop with a lazy kick. For this person, setting out into open water is not a rare drama. It is part of a seasonal routine like planting in spring or gathering in autumn. Some voyages hug familiar coasts. Others strike outward across wide gaps, timed around how many days each crossing should take, and how grumpy everyone will be if the wind chooses the wrong mood. You pull your cloak tighter, feel the gentle roll of the deck under your body, and let the hush of the sea smooth the noise in your head as the ship glides forward into the night. You sit a little lower on the bench as the dark settles more cleanly over the sea, and the world narrows to three things: you, the ship beneath you, and the thin line where sky and water meet. That line does not look important at first. It is only a slightly brighter band where the last crumbs of light cling before they give up. Yet, for people on small wooden hulls, this quiet stripe is one of the first tools for knowing where you are and where you are heading. Your eyes take time to adjust. At first you see almost nothing. Then shapes grow out of the dim. The horizon becomes a soft arc that wraps around you, broken only by a faint lump that might be an island or just your imagination getting dramatic. Above that arc, the sky keeps changing. Clouds thin and thicken. The glow of fading sunlight softens and then drains away. Even when the sun itself has slipped from sight, its position still leaves a trace in the sky, like a smudged fingerprint. You begin to understand why people pay such close attention to this meeting of sky and sea. In some regions, sailors learn that light hazes often hang above distant shorelines because the land warms the air differently from open water. A faint, bright band appears barely visible, hinting that something solid waits far away. It is not magic. It is simply warm and cool air playing their quiet games. But if you know how to read it, you can tell whether you are drifting toward land or away from it. A crew member touches your shoulder and points toward a thicker clump of cloud low on the horizon. The shape looks ordinary. The color is nothing special. Still, that person marks it and then glances at the steering oar. The choice of direction folds this small hint into a long chain of remembered patterns. In one part of the year, certain cloud bands tend to form above steady wind belts. A narrow, bright streak can reveal where clear air holds court. A darker smudge might signal a region of stubborn bad weather. Your sleepy eyes see only gray. Experienced eyes see paths, walls, and doors. One clear historical fact threads along these waters. Sailors in northern Europe spend generations learning the moods of the North Atlantic and nearby seas, enough that later chroniclers remark on their ability to travel long distances in what to outside observers look like very basic ships. The hull beneath you is not a toy. It is carefully shaped to flex with waves, light enough to drag over shallows, and long enough to carry cargo and fighters when needed, yet none of that helps if you push off in the wrong direction and keep stubbornly going. You find yourself staring at the horizon as if it will suddenly reveal a clear arrow. It does not. Instead, it keeps offering small changes. The wind feels slightly cooler on one cheek than the other. A faint line of darker water stretches across the surface far ahead like a bruise. Tiny details like this tell experienced sailors about wind fronts and pressure differences. You could almost treat the sea as a weather app that forgot to add text labels and friendly icons. Every now and then, small birds pass across that pale border between sea and sky. They do not appear in dramatic swarms. They simply flicker into sight and then vanish toward some point you cannot see. Among seafarers, there is a long habit of watching birds, not only because they look pretty, although some of them do, but because many species rarely stray far from land. If you sit on a ship for hours and suddenly begin seeing more and more of these creatures heading in the same general direction, you pay attention. If you feel uncertain, a patient watcher might quietly suggest following the winged commute. Historians still argue whether crews on voyages like this ever shape such observations into strict rules, or whether reading sky and birds remains mostly an intuitive experience-based art. From your place on the bench, it feels less like a secret code and more like getting to know a very large, shy animal that only communicates in subtle hints. You are not handed an official manual. You simply share space with older crew members who point out patterns and let your brain collect them one calm evening at a time. The sky deepens toward full night. Along the western rim, you still sense a soft suggestion of light, almost like the memory of a sunset, rather than the thing itself. The person at the steering oar keeps the ship oriented against that fading glow for a while, using the last known position of the invisible sun as a rough guide. It is a simple method. If you know where the sun rose and where it set, and you understand the arc it travels at this time of year, you can treat that arc as a direction keeper. During some seasons in northern latitudes, twilight lingers for a long time, stretching out the period in which the sky continues to help you before stars fully take over the night shift. On those long evenings, you do not need complicated instruments. You only need a sense of how the sun has moved and how that movement relates to the way your ship points. Here and there on deck, you notice small quirks that lighten all this watchful staring. One sailor swears that a particular kind of pinkish haze always means an inconvenient headwind is coming, and mutters at it the moment he sees even a trace. Another insists that a puffy cloud shape resembles his cousin and treats it as a warning to avoid risky decisions which may say more about the cousin than the cloud. Little personal myths like this grow around the real patterns, comforting in their own way, even if the science behind Cousin Cloud is very weak. As the ship keeps gliding forward, the line between sea and sky becomes less a simple edge and more a soft band full of information. You start to feel drowsy, but your eyes still track the tiny differences in light and shape. The human brain is very good at pattern hunting even when tired. Out here, that quiet habit becomes a survival trick. Every smudge, stripe, and flicker adds one more hint to an invisible route stretching across the dark water. You wake from a light doze to the feeling that the ship is gliding closer to something larger than open water. The air smells different. Less open salt, more earth and plants, even though you still see waves around you. Ahead, a dark wall begins to rise, not straight, not neat, but full of jagged edges that catch the faint light. You are drawing near a coastline, and for the people on this ship, that means navigation suddenly gains a lot more detail. The closer you get, the more the shore resolves into parts. A steep headland that juts out like a shoulder. A narrow inlet with calm water tucked inside. A cluster of low hills farther back that bend into a loose curve. To you, it all looks wild, but crew members are already pinning labels on these shapes in their minds, linking them to stories, routes, and old memories of storms that once went badly or surprisingly well. In this world, seafarers often treat coastlines like paragraph breaks in a long story. Long stretches of open water separate these chapters, but when you reach a familiar bay or cliff, you take stock. One solid historical fact is that ships in northern seas regularly follow known sailing routes up and down the coasts of Scandinavia and beyond, moving between trading towns, farm settlements, and seasonal markets. Specific headlands, river mouths, and islands become fixed points along these sailing paths, almost like pins on a mental map. You drift near enough now to see individual rocks at the base of the cliffs and narrow beaches where pale water curls in thin lines. One rocky outcrop reaches out into the sea and then bends slightly, forming a shape that looks suspiciously like a giant animal nose. A nearby rower gives it a name that is not very flattering and clearly based on someone back home. You realize that many of these places pick up unofficial names like that, shaped by jokes, mistakes, and gossip. It is easier to remember that you must turn inward at Big Nose Rock than at an anonymous gray lump. The ship follows the contour of the land rather than aiming straight out across open sea. This practice earns an easy nickname in some later traditions as coasting, and for good reason. By hugging the shore, you keep solid visual markers nearby. It is safer, at least in decent weather, and it lets you gather local knowledge at stops along the way. If you imagine the coastline as a string, then each bay, headland, and fjord is a bead that you slide your mental fingers over as you travel. Sailors sometimes call the sea itself a road, and in Old Norse poetry, you find phrases that treat the ocean as a place where whales travel like wagons on a highway. You begin to see why. Out beyond the coastal shallows, dark backs occasionally roll in and out of the swell. These huge animals follow their own seasonal paths, but they also mark regions of deep water that ships can cross. To someone raised on such poetry, the image of a whale road is not just decorative. It matches what you see from the deck, where living creatures show you lanes that cut through the wide blue. Historians still argue whether every long-distance voyage in this culture relies mainly on following land as closely as possible, or whether more daring crews happily strike out across longer stretches of open water when the circumstances look favorable. Some experimental voyages in modern times show that both approaches can work. But from where you sit now, staying near the line of cliffs feels like a comforting compromise between courage and common sense. As the ship glides along the coast, you start to notice that not all parts of the shore feel the same. Some stretches have steep rock dropping, almost straight into the water where anchoring would be awkward and landing even worse. Other sections open into wide, calm bays where streams trickle down from the valleys. The experienced crew members quietly mark which spots might hide a friendly farm, a trading settlement, or at least a flat piece of ground where you can camp without waking up sliding into the sea. One practical trick takes the form of river mouths. Where fresh water runs into the sea, the surface near shore changes color and texture. The water may look slightly muddier, or a faint line of foam might stretch outward along the current. If you have seen this pattern before in connection with a particular river, you can recognize it even from a distance. In an age when written charts are rare or absent, a memory of how a river and its surroundings look from the sea becomes as important as any ink on parchment. You watch the helmsman steer around small islands that dot the path like stepping stones. Each one creates its own swirl of currents and wind eddies, forcing the person on the steering oar to adjust. Some islands host tiny settlements or single farmsteads. Others stay empty except for birds and stubborn grass. Crew members trade small bits of information as you pass. Someone remembers that one particular island has a sheltered cove on the far side where a ship can wait out bad weather. Another warns about submerged rocks near a different shore that once took a bite out of a relative's hull. Even in this careful tracing of coasts, there are moments of humor. One sailor, pointing to a narrow, twisted channel between two rocks, announces that this is where his uncle managed to run a boat aground on a calm day with no wind, which is apparently still a family legend. Another claims that a certain cliff face looks exactly like a grumpy chieftain, and that you should never talk back when sailing past, just in case. You suspect that the sea is not listening, but these jokes help people catalog features in their heads. Laughter becomes a memory aid disguised as entertainment. If you zoomed out in your mind, you could imagine all these coastlines and islands strung together across a huge region, forming a network of known places. Farmers, traders, and raiders share information about these locations at markets and gatherings. A description might be as simple as saying that a harbor lies 2 days' sail past a certain promontory, turning inward where the hills begin to flatten. The instructions are imprecise by modern standards, but they rely on a shared experience of how long a day's travel feels in different winds and currents. Historians still argue whether some of these routes become standardized enough to count as proper sea lanes in the modern sense, or whether they remain more flexible, changing with local conditions and individual preference. What you feel from your seat on the longship is a strong sense that certain chains of headlands, islands, and river mouths are used again and again, becoming familiar pathways not easily forgotten. As the ship moves onward, the coastline gradually shifts in form and mood. You pass regions where the land rises high and steep, and others where it droops into softer hills. With each change, new possibilities open and old ones close. There are cliffs that shelter you from certain winds and bays that funnel gusts straight into your sails, whether you like it or not. The people who know these coasts learn which combinations of land shape and wind direction help them, and which combinations deserve respect. The slow rhythm of passing landmarks begins to lull you. Headlands, inlets, islands, and distant mountains each take their turn at the edge of your vision, like actors stepping briefly onto a stage and then slipping back behind the curtain. Each one carries a story, a warning, or a promise of safe rest, and together they build a chain of memory that can guide you far beyond any single journey you make in this quiet rocking night. Morning spreads slowly across the sea, not in a blaze of color, but in a gentle lifting of darkness, as if someone behind the horizon is opening their eyes a little wider each minute. You blink against the pale band of light along the rim of the world and feel the ship change mood. Ropes creak, oars shift, and conversations turn their faces upward. Long before the day grows warm, the sun already gives everyone a job. You tilt your head back and feel the first weak warmth on your skin. On land, the sun is just a big, reliable clock that tells you whether you overslept or picked a bad time for laundry. Out here, it becomes a ruler, compass, and a silent instructor that never wastes a word. The only way to learn its lessons is to watch it every day, in every season, until its path across the sky feels as familiar as the route from your bed to your kitchen. One plain historical fact sits behind this routine. People know that the sun rises in the eastern sky and sets in the western sky, even though its exact track bends higher or lower, depending on the time of year and how far north or south you travel. By paying attention to where it appears at dawn and where it sinks at dusk, sailors build a sense of direction that does not depend on magnets or metal needles, only on the steady turning of the earth. Someone beside you carries a small wooden disc and a short peg. The disc looks almost embarrassingly simple, a flat circle with a faint ring scratched into its surface. The peg fits into a hole at the center and stands upright like a tiny mast. This humble object is a sun shadow board, a device that can help keep a steady course during the day. It will never win a prize for dramatic design. No one would make an expensive scene about a disc and a stick unless the film budget has completely collapsed, but its usefulness matters more than its looks. The sailor kneels where the planks lie fairly level and sets the board down so it sits flat. The little peg throws a sharp shadow across the surface. At first, that shadow points wherever it pleases. As the helmsman brings the long hull into the chosen path, the user of the board turns the disc until the shadow falls exactly along the scratched ring. The rule is simple. If you can keep that little patch of darkness cutting the ring in the same way while the sun moves across the sky, you know you are holding your direction. You watch the worker keep one eye on the board and one eye on the sea. When the ship drifts, the shadow slides away from the ring. A quiet word travels to the steering oar, and the hull eases back until the shadow returns. The whole process looks almost too calm for something that might be guiding you across days of open water. There is no ceremony, no raised voices, just a small, restless line of darkness that quietly says yes or no. Historians still argue whether crews on long voyages regularly use such boards or whether they remain the speciality of a few experimental navigators. Some point to later descriptions and modern reconstructions that seem to support their use. Others suggest that practiced sailors can do just as well by watching the sun itself without any tool. Sitting on this bench watching the repeated small corrections, you can easily imagine both habits existing side by side, with some captains trusting wood and shadow and others trusting only their own eyes. While the sun climbs higher, you notice other ways it guides the ship. Around midday, when it reaches its highest point, you can roughly judge direction by where it stands in the sky. If your path should run mostly north and south, you pay attention to whether the sun leans more toward your right or your left at that high moment. Over many voyages, you learn how the height of the sun changes as you move closer to or farther from the polar regions. You do not need numbers or charts. Your body simply remembers that on this route, in this month, the midday sun ought to sit at a certain height above the rail. One crew member jokes that the sun is a stubborn supervisor who never takes a day off, always arrives early, and constantly tells you when you have drifted off task. At least, he adds, this supervisor does not hold meetings, which earns a sleepy round of agreement. Another sailor claims to tell the time to a narrow span just from the brightness and angle of the light on the inside of the hull, a boast that makes others roll their eyes but still glance at the boards as if checking. A small, quirky habit appears when someone hangs a strip of leather from the rigging where it can swing freely. It looks like decoration until you notice how often eyes flick toward it. The strip sways in response to the wind and the ship's movement. By watching its angle, the crew can feel how the push of air matches what the sun suggests about the middle of the day. Above, thin, high clouds can soften the brightness. Thicker, low clouds may hide the sun altogether, yet the sky remains slightly lighter in its direction, and the water there carries a faint sheen. If you stop staring at sharp edges and let your gaze relax, the whole dome of the sky becomes a slow-moving dial that still points roughly toward the hidden fire. One solid fact about these northern latitudes shapes every season of travel. Daylight length swings widely across the year. In high summer, the sun may barely dip below the horizon, leaving long hours of glowing twilight. In deep winter, daylight shrinks into a short, low arc that clings to the horizon and disappears before you feel properly awake. Seafarers adapt their routes to this rhythm. In long, bright seasons, they use the sun almost all day for guidance. In darker months, they plan more cautiously, favor nearby coasts, and respect how quickly weather can erase both light and confidence. Historians still argue whether people on these ships ever think in tidy angles and degrees, or whether their knowledge stays tied to direct impressions like how far the sun rises above a mast at noon when you sail to a certain harbor. From your place on the bench, it feels very much like the second. No one here sketches diagrams. They let years of watching light and shadow soak slowly into their bones until the position of the sun feels like an old habit rather than an abstract idea. You find yourself practicing quietly. You close your eyes for a moment, then open them and try to guess where the sun will stand before you look straight at it. When you are right, you feel a small lift in your chest, the warm pride of sharing one tiny skill with the crew. When you are wrong, you quietly blame the clouds, which is a convenient excuse that works across all centuries. As the day stretches on and the sun glides from one side of the sky to the other, the shadow on the board keeps sliding, and the helmsman keeps nudging the ship along its chosen line. The steady light wraps your face and hands the hull rocks softly, and the journey is measured not in miles, but in the slow drift of brightness across water and skin. You lie flat on the damp planks, with your cloak wrapped tight, watching the last colors drain from the sky until the world above you settles into deep blue. The noises of the ship quieten. Voices drop oars, rest a few snores, begin early auditions in the dark. What stays wide awake is the sky. One by one, stars punch their tiny pinholes through the fading light until there are too many to count. At first, the stars look like random glitter scattered across velvet. Then your eyes start sorting them without you even trying. You notice a brighter point, low to one side of the sky, then another higher up, then a crooked line that keeps pulling your attention. People around you have grown up with names for these groups and stories that stick to them like burrs to wool. Warriors, animals, tools, and strange shapes live up there marching across the night in familiar patterns. You feel someone shift beside you, and then a fingertip touches your arm, draws your gaze toward a particular star that shines a little steadier than many of its neighbors. This is the one that matters most for a long voyage in northern waters. If you follow that point with your eyes, you see that the whole sky seems to slowly wheel around it, while that one stays almost fixed. There is a solid historical fact hiding in that quiet behavior. This star sits close to the line of the Earth's axis in the sky, so as the planet turns, everything else appears to rotate around it. If you can find this point, you can find north. You discover that locating it is part trick, part simple geometry. Nearby is a familiar shape, the pattern many people later call a Big Dipper or a plow. If you pick the two stars at the edge of its bowl and draw an imaginary line out from them, you land on the steadier star at the center of the wheel. Once your eyes learn that jump, you can find it even when half distracted or half asleep. From then on, that tiny light becomes a quiet anchor, telling you which way the ship points at any hour of the night. Historians still argue whether every longship crew in early centuries relies formally on this star, or whether some simply absorb it into a mix of instinct and coastal knowledge. From where you lie, the debate feels slightly amusing. You do not fill out a report each time you glance up. You just keep checking that small fixed point while the waves move underneath, the way a driver in a city keeps half an eye on road signs. Once your mind grasps the idea that stars can fix direction, a new layer of information unfolds. You notice that some constellations rise from the same part of the horizon at particular times of year, cross the sky in consistent paths, and set in predictable zones. If you spend enough nights on the water, these tracks begin to feel like lifted ropes stretched overhead. Instead of flat dots, the sky becomes a lattice of moving lines, and your route through the sea threads between them. There is a simple but powerful fact hidden in this pattern. The position of certain stars above the horizon shifts depending on how far north or south you travel. When you move toward higher latitudes, the steady star climbs a little higher in the sky. As you drift toward lower latitudes, it sinks. You only need to remember that on a voyage to one familiar harbor, the star sits roughly at the height of a certain yard on the mast, while on another route, it hangs lower, closer to the rim of the hull. A quirky habit develops among some sailors who turn this into a sort of nighttime measuring game. One person might hold up a hand at arm's length and count how many finger widths separate the star from the horizon on a known route. Another uses the span between thumb and little finger as a rough gauge. It is not precise, and anyone with shorter arms gets gently teased, but over time, these small body-based tools become surprisingly reliable for telling whether you are on the right latitude. The rest of the sky refuses to stay in the background. To the east, new constellations crawl up from the horizon as the night turns. The ones near the north never fully set. They swing in slow circles around the central star, like guests who never quite leave the party. Farther south groups rise and fall, some tied in stories to farming seasons, others linked to seafaring and travel. Remembering which pattern should be visible at which time of year and at which height above the water gives you another quiet check on your position. Along the faint, cloudy band that many later cultures call the Milky Way, you see a soft river of light pouring across the darkness. Some people interpret this as a path for souls, some as a road for birds, some as spilt food from a celestial feast. Whatever the story, the band itself can serve as another line of orientation. If you know how it tilts across the sky at different times of night, you can use its angle like a great hazy arrow. On very clear nights, the sheer number of stars can feel overwhelming. Your mind wants to trace patterns everywhere, the way people see faces in tree bark or assign personalities to household appliances. A rower near you claims that if you stare at one cluster long enough, it starts to look like the ship's owner, scowling at unpaid debts, and everyone quickly agrees that this is a good reason to face in a different direction. Humor does not move the stars, but it keeps tired sailors from turning awe into anxiety. All the while, the ship glides forward, guided by small, repeated glances lifted from deck to sky and back again. You feel the gentle swell roll under your body and see how the mast and rigging frame bits of the sky into their own little windows. Each window carries its patch of pattern, and your brain quietly records how those patches change as hours pass. You are not memorizing a chart. You are living inside one, letting it settle over you until direction at night feels less like guesswork and more like listening to a song you know so well you can hum the next note before it comes. You sit up as a small change runs through the air, a subtle shift that has nothing to do with clouds or light. The breeze that once stroked your cheek from one side now brushes from a slightly different angle. The sail flutters, rustles like a restless animal, then settles into a new curve. The whole hull twitches under you. In that moment, the ship feels less like a passive object and more like a nervous, opinionated creature you are slowly learning to read. You pay attention to your skin first. The wind is cool with a faint sting of salt and damp. When it hits you full in the face, your eyes want to narrow and your lips pull tight. That is the feeling of pushing into it, asking the ship to climb the air as well as the waves. When the wind slides past your ear, tugging at your hood and pressing your cloak flat against your back, you are running with it, letting it shove the hull along from behind. Those differences become a soft, constant compass that needs no metal needle at all. A clear historical fact hides in how responsive everything feels. The ships on these northern seas are clinker-built with overlapping planks and a shallow draft that lets them ride high on the water. That makes them fast and agile, able to slip into rivers and skim over sandbars. It also means they faithfully transmit every push of wind and every bump of swell straight into the feet and hands of anyone paying attention. What would feel frighteningly flimsy to someone used to heavy modern hulls becomes, in experienced hands, an extra sense. You rest your palm flat on the deck and close your eyes. The movement under you no longer feels like simple rocking. There is a slow, deep roll that pushes your body to one side, hesitates, then eases it back. That rhythm is the swell, the long waves that march across open water, carrying the memory of storms from far away. On top of that deeper pulse, you feel smaller, quicker bumps from local wind waves. Separating those two motions in your mind is like learning to hear bass and melody as separate lines in the same song. You begin to notice patterns. Sometimes the swell lifts the bow gently and sets it down on the far side of each long ridge. At other times, the hull climbs at an angle, slides down sideways, and gives your stomach a small, disagreeable wobble. When the ship's path matches the direction of the main swell, the ride feels smoother, almost lazy. When you cross the swell at a sharp angle, boards creek water slaps the hull, and you have to brace your feet more carefully. Historians still argue whether crews on voyages like this ever teach wave and swell patterns as a formal part of navigation, or whether that understanding grows quietly from sheer repetition. From where you sit, it does not feel like a classroom subject. No one stands at the bow and recites rules about wave geometry. Instead, older sailors murmur things like the sea feels long from the west tonight, or these are home swells, and your body slowly learns what that means. You notice a small, almost silly-looking decoration on the rigging. A short length of cord, a scrap of feather, and a few strands of wool are tied to a line where they can swing freely. At first you think it is just someone's bored craft project. Then you realize how many glances flick toward it. The feather shivers when the breeze freshens, flicks in a new direction the moment the wind veers even a little. One of the crew pats it fondly and calls it the tiny admiral because everyone seems to obey it without argument. It is a low-tech wind indicator with almost ridiculous sensitivity. Below your feet, the hull speaks and creaks and knocks. A deep groan runs along the ribs when a long swell lifts the ship squarely from behind. A sharper creak sounds when waves hit at an angle and twist the structure slightly. Over time, people learn to tell the difference between worrying sounds and ordinary ones. Some swear they can sense nearby land purely from the way the ship begins to jerk and stumble as long, clean swells break into shorter, confused chop over rising seafloor. You lean into a handrail and feel how the once smooth roll takes on a touch of nervous twitching, like a horse that has suddenly scented something ahead. You lean over the side and study the water directly. When the wind has blown steady for a while, ranks of small ripples line up, all pointing in roughly the same direction. The crests look like thin, silver pencil strokes drawn across the darker blue. If the bow cuts straight along those lines, the ship glides with less fuss. If it crosses them, each ridge taps the hull a soft, repeated knock that you can almost count. With practice, those taps tell you whether your course has drifted without you needing to search the horizon. Another dependable fact shapes these journeys. In this part of the world, certain winds dominate in certain seasons. People who sail here do not treat the air as random. They know that at particular times of year, a steady wind can blow from the same broad quarter for days or even weeks. Routes are planned around that. You do not choose a path that asks your crew to row against a season-long headwind if you can angle your journey differently and let the sail do the work. Of course, there is always at least one person who thinks testing the limits sounds fun. A helmsman may boast that he can hold a true course for a whole watch, with his eyes closed, guided only by wind on his skin and the roll under his feet. The crew, amused and slightly alarmed, insists on a trial. For a few minutes, he closes his eyes while someone else keeps a hand on the steering oar, ready to rescue the experiment. The ship actually stays surprisingly steady. When they finally let him look again, everyone agrees that his sense of direction is impressive, but his sense of self-preservation might need work. Beneath the laughter lies a constant habit of quiet checking. Wind on your cheeks is compared with the feather on the rigging. The feel of the swell is compared with the season. All of it is compared with where you think the coastline should be, even if it is far beyond sight. If everything agrees, you relax a little. If some part of the puzzle feels wrong, tension creeps in and more eyes turn to sea and sky. The air itself adds more hints. On some nights, it feels thin and empty, smelling of salt and little else. On others, it brings tiny threads of scent that do not belong to open water at all. You might catch the faint sourness of bird colonies, the green hint of land plants, or a cool, dusty trace like wet stone. Those impressions do not come with labels. They slip out in small comments, like the air tastes close tonight or something smells like rocks. The words are vague, but the instinct behind them is sharp. You let your fingers slide along the inside of the hull where the planks meet. Every shiver runs into your bones. You start to tell apart the heavy lift of a deep ocean swell, from the restless, uneven jump of waves shaped by currents and shoaling ground. Even with no lighthouse, no coastline, no helpful city glow, you begin to sense when the character of the water is changing. In that quiet, it becomes clear that out here your most reliable navigation tools are not made of wood, iron, or glass. They live in your balance, your hearing, your skin, and the steady choice to keep noticing what the sea and the wind are trying to say. You lean against the side of the ship and let your gaze soften over the water. At first it feels like nothing is out here with you, only gray-blue swells and a low sky. Then movement begins to separate from the background. A narrow wing flashes white as a bird, skims just above the crests. Another shape glides higher up, circling in wide, lazy loops that seem to ignore the small worries on your crowded wooden deck. A hand brushes your sleeve and a crew member points toward a distant patch of sky. Several birds rise and fall there in a loose cluster, all heading roughly the same way. That is not random movement. Many seabirds spend the day feeding over open water and then return to their nesting places on land. One solid historical fact is that experienced sailors learn to watch these daily commutes the way modern commuters read traffic maps. If birds are scattered, you may still be deep in the open sea. When more and more appear in the evening, all flying steadily toward one horizon, it often hints that land sits somewhere beneath that invisible point. You follow the flock with your eyes. Some flap constantly, busy and determined, like workers afraid of being late. Others barely move their wings and let the wind carry them, sliding along long, straight paths. Each kind of bird has its own habits, and those habits quietly share clues with anyone patient enough to notice. People on the ship give them nicknames that make them easier to remember. One small species that often arrives before rough weather earns a name that basically means grumpy ant. Another, whose visits usually match good fishing, is known as generous cousin. No one remembers its proper name once that label sticks. Historians still argue whether people on these northern seas ever turn birdwatching into a strict method or whether it remains a loose web of sayings and local experience. One person might insist that a certain bird never flies far from land, while another swears they saw that same bird on a long crossing. The birds do not care who wins the argument. They chase food and follow wind patterns, and careful crews borrow their patterns whenever they line up with practice. Farther from the hull, the sea suddenly bulges and breaks. A smooth, dark back curves up through the waves. Then a puff of mist blooms into the air. A whale exhales, and the sound reaches you as a deep breath that seems to roll inside your ribs. For a brief moment, the ship feels very small. These huge animals follow their own routes through the water, moving along bands of temperature and food rather than along coastlines and borders drawn on a map. Sailors sometimes describe the ocean as a road for whales. The image fits when you see how often these giants appear in certain broad belts of water. To a watchful navigator, regular sightings hint at deeper channels and feeding grounds that stretch from region to region. You do not chase a whale the way you would follow a cart along a road, but noticing that you keep meeting them in the same kind of sea tells you that you have entered a familiar zone. Sometimes a whale comes close enough that you can see lighter marks on its skin and the slow roll of a fin. One playful crew member clicks their tongue and claims they are quietly asking it for directions. Another replies that whales charge very high fees, mostly in patience and fish, and that the contract is never worth it. The joke earns a few tired smiles and loosens some shoulders. Humor does not move the ship, but it makes sharing the sea with huge neighbors easier to bear. You draw a long breath and suddenly realize that something in the air has changed. The strong salt scent remains, but a new note threads through it. It is faint and fragile, like a tune half heard from another room, yet clearly different. There is a green edge now, a hint of plants and earth that do not grow out here. Your nose is not trained, but people who live their lives on the water treat those small shifts as everyday information. Short comments pass between the crew in low voices. Someone mentions that the air smells close, as if bouncing off something solid. Another notes a sour tone that often comes from great bird colonies on cliffs. On some days, you might even catch a smoky trace of wood fires drifting from distant settlements, especially when the wind blows steadily from a single direction. No single smell proves anything. Put together with what you see and feel, it comes another line on an invisible chart. A steady fact about waves quietly supports all these hints. As a ship moves closer to shore, the behavior of the sea usually changes. Long, even swells begin to break into shorter, more confused waves as they feel rising ground beneath them. Your body notices before your thoughts do. Knees bend a little differently. The hull stumbles slightly where it once glided. Matched with thicker bird traffic, drifting plants, and a faint thread of land scent on the wind, the pattern becomes very hard to ignore. Historians still argue whether people at sea lean more on animal behavior or on the feel of water and air when they sense land beyond the horizon. From your place on the moving deck, it seems that no single sign receives complete trust. Birds can wander far. Whales can surprise you. Smells can travel in odd ways when the weather plays tricks. What matters is the collection of small hints that slowly begin to agree. You watch another loose line of birds cross the sky, listen for another soft whale breath, and take another slow inhale of the changing air. Your eyes grow heavy, but some quietly alert part of your mind keeps adding these signals together. In a world without compasses and glowing screens, the route toward land takes shape in feathers, fins, scents, and the feel of the sea under the hull. All you have to do is keep noticing and let your senses build a map that lives entirely inside your body. You lean your elbows on the rail and look straight down. The water is not just one flat color. It folds and slides and glimmers in layers as if someone spilled several shades of paint and then stirred them slowly with a giant spoon. Small waves pass under the hull, catching the light in quick flashes. Between those flashes, you start to see that some patches of sea glow a deeper blue, some a duller green, and some carry a faint brownish stain. A quiet voice beside you tells you that deep open water wears a different coat than water that has brushed the land. When the sea is very deep and clear, it often looks dark and intense, almost like polished glass soaked in sky. Where rivers spill out from the shore, they carry fine mud and tiny bits of plants. That mix makes the surface duller and more opaque. A simple historical fact is that seafarers learn to tell these waters apart because the color shift can mean you are gliding over a river mouth or a coastal shelf long before any land appears. You watch as the ship passes from one shade into another. There is no sharp border, just a soft transition where greenish water slowly gives way to bluer tones. To your eyes, it looks like a subtle change in mood. To someone who has spent years on these decks, it is a message. They know that brownish streaks may hint at silt drifting from an unseen shore, while milky patches can come from glacial rivers grinding stone into fine powder far inland. The sea surface becomes a canvas where distant valleys quietly sign their names. Foam clings to that canvas in strange patterns. At first you think the white froth that rides between waves is random. Then you notice long, thin lines of foam stretching across the water, sometimes almost straight, sometimes curling gently. These lines do not move quite like the waves around them. They drift more slowly, holding their shape as the rest of the surface heaves and sinks. They mark places where different water masses meet, sliding past each other and gathering anything that floats. One of the crew taps your arm and traces one foam line with a finger. He explains that these streaks can tell you which way the surface currents run. Bits of seaweed, splinters of wood, little scraps of feather all collect along those boundaries. If you drop something light into the water and see where it drifts along the foam, you get a preview of how the current might tug at your hull. It is the ocean's way of drawing arrows, even if the arrows are wobbly and smell like old fish. Historians still argue whether sailors in early northern voyages treat these foam lines as a formal tool to plan routes, or whether they mostly notice them in passing, using them only when desperate for extra hints. Watching how carefully eyes follow the drifting streaks around you, it seems likely that at least some navigators quietly store this information, even if they never give it a grand name. You do not need a theory if your hands and eyes already know how it feels. Closer to the ship, small objects ride the water like patient hitchhikers. A piece of rounded wood bumps the hull, spins once, and continues on its way. A few strands of seaweed trail their long stems just below the surface. A clump of grasses that clearly began life on land bobs up and down in a way that would make any careful farmer wince. Each object has its own story, and each story begins somewhere that is not this patch of sea. People long voyages pay attention to those stories. In regions where forests grow along certain coasts and not along others, driftwood can reveal directions. A solid fact from northern settlements is that in some treeless places, washed-up timber is so valuable that people collect and reuse it for years. If you see particular kinds of wood floating far out on the water, it suggests which distant shores the currents connect you to. A log of a familiar species can whisper that you are traveling within reach of a known landmass, even when no coastline shows on the horizon. Seaweed gives its own hints. Some species cling to rocks in shallow water and rarely break free unless storms tear them loose. When you spot that kind of plant floating by in quantity, it often means you are entering a region with underwater ridges and coastal shallows. You may not know the exact shape of what lies beneath, but you know it is no longer empty depth. Your steering hand becomes a little more cautious. Someone jokes that big clumps of weed are like the ocean's laundry hanging everywhere when the world has had a rough night. You watch as a long foam line slides along the side of the ship. It carries a whole mess of debris, broken twigs, pale chips of bark, a torn feather, even the sad, flattened remains of something that might once have been a hat. One of the younger rowers announces in a solemn voice that this proves an entire village of seabirds has gone to a very untidy market, which earns a sleepy laugh. Under the joke lies a practical scan. People pick out anything unusual, anything that might say more than simple storm leftovers. Sometimes crew members scoop up a bit of floating plant in a bucket and inspect it more closely. They look at the type of weed, the little shells clinging to it, the color of the slime that trails away in the water. To you, it looks like messy soup. To them, it is a traveling letter from the coast. They may not know which stretch of land the letter came from, but if they have seen similar bundles near particular islands or river mouths, they add that to their growing inner map. Another habit seems almost theatrical. A sailor dips his hand into the water, lifts a small pool in his palm, and tastes it carefully. At first you think he is simply being dramatic. Then you remember that where fresh water pours into the sea, the top layer can be slightly less salty. You might not be able to drink it happily unless you enjoy disappointment, but a sensitive tongue can sometimes feel a tiny difference. Combined with changes in color and debris, that taste can confirm that you are nearing a large river's outflow, even when the river itself is hidden behind the curve of the earth. Historians still argue whether such tasting becomes a common practice, or whether it belongs mostly to a few particularly devoted navigators who are willing to sip the ocean in the name of accuracy. Whether or not everyone does it, the idea fits with what you see all around you. Nothing on this water is wasted. Every shade, every scent, every piece of floating scrap has the potential to say where you are going or where you should not go. The longer you stare at the surface, the more it begins to look like a moving map. Darker lanes of water snake between lighter ones. Patches of small, short chop rub against smoother swells, like overlapping patterns in cloth. In some places, the water seems to wrinkle as if two currents are pressing against each other from different angles. Where those wrinkles show, the foam gathers, and where the foam gathers, the debris rides. A patient navigator can follow those chains of texture as if tracing lines on a page. You find yourself playing a small game. When you see a shift in color ahead, you try to guess what it will feel like when the hull reaches it. Will the waves become shorter? Will the ship lift more sharply? When your guesses match the actual movement, you feel the same quiet satisfaction you felt when you first learned to track the sun. The sea is turning into a teacher that rarely speaks, but never stops demonstrating. Over time, the habit of scanning watercolor foam lines and floating debris settles into you the way a melody does. You no longer stare with hard focus. Instead, you let your eyes relax, taking in the whole surface at once. Any change stands out the way a single wrong note jumps from a song you have heard 100 times. Out here, without compasses or glowing screens, the boundary between science and instinct grows thin. You simply keep watching, keep feeling, and let the living surface of the sea trace your path long before any land is kind enough to appear. You wake to a sky that looks sulky and undecided, a flat lid of pale cloud pressed low over the sea. There is no neat sunrise to admire, no clear beam of light pointing across the water, just a soft gray glow that seems to come from everywhere at once. If you were hoping the sun would act like a big friendly arrow today, it has clearly decided to call in sick. The ship still needs a direction. The oars still need to pull in some kind of straight line. You feel that quiet unease that comes when your main guide hides behind a curtain. People move more slowly, eyes narrowed, measuring the sky with a hint of suspicion. Near the center of the deck, an older sailor kneels by a small chest and lifts out something that looks strangely delicate in all this wood and wool. You see a clear crystal about the size of a chicken egg, cut roughly so it fits in a calloused palm. It catches the gray light in an odd way, not like glass, not like still water, but with a faint, doubled shimmer along its edges. This is what many stories call a sunstone, a piece of transparent rock that can help you find the position of the hidden sun, even when the sky behaves like a wet blanket. There is one straightforward historical fact at work here. Certain crystals, such as Iceland spar, split light into two slightly different rays as it passes through them. When you look through such a stone, lines and shapes can appear doubled. More importantly for you on this cramped deck, the stone can highlight the direction of polarized light in the sky. That is a complicated way of saying that even when clouds hide the sun, the scattered daylight still carries a pattern, and this crystal can reveal that pattern to patient eyes. The sailor holds the sunstone up at arm length and slowly rotates it. You squint through it, feeling slightly ridiculous. At first, all you see is a milky blur. Then, as the stone turns, two faint patches of brightness slide over each other inside the crystal-like overlapping ghosts. At one particular angle, those patches balance neither brighter nor dimmer than the other. The sailor makes a small, satisfied sound and lowers the stone and points toward one spot in the gray sky. According to this little trick, that is where the sun is hiding. Historians still argue whether such crystals are truly used on long voyages in early centuries, or whether the references in later texts are more poetic than practical. Some point to finds of calcite crystals on wrecks from later periods and suggest that navigators kept this trick in their bag of tools. Others think the whole idea sounds like a sailor story polished long after the fact. On this rolling deck, the argument feels very far away. You care less about lectures and more about whether the next gust of wind will be helpful. The sailor repeats the process several times, turning slowly in place, lifting the crystal and rotating it until the twin light patches inside line up again. Each time the invisible point of the sun falls along the same broad direction. To fix this information, someone scratches a small charcoal mark on the gunwale, a reminder of where that hidden star really sits behind its blanket of cloud. The ship adjusts its heading until that mark matches the chosen course. No compass needle swings yet, the effect is similar. There is something quietly theatrical about this moment. You are standing on damp planks in the middle of a grey ocean, watching a human turn a rock into a navigation aid. It would be easy to call it magic if you did not know about light and polarization. A younger crew member clearly prefers the magical version, whispering that the stone only works for people who treat it politely. Another claims that if you complain too much about the weather, the sunstone refuses to cooperate. It is a playful way to remind everyone not to panic when the sky sulks. Once you get the hang of it, the process grows strangely soothing. You stand near the rail, breathe in the cool, moist air, and lift the stone. You slowly turn it, watching the little bright shapes drift and merge. When they balance, you lower your arm, note the direction, then feel the ship lean slightly as the steering oar adjusts. It becomes a kind of gray sky ritual. Lift, turn, judge, correct. Each repetition lays another thin layer of confidence over the basic uncertainty of traveling under a dull ceiling. One more clear fact about northern regions makes this tool tempting. In high latitudes, the sun can sit low in the sky for much of the year. At certain times, the light slides around the horizon in a slow, shallow arc, rather than climbing high overhead. When clouds hang thick, that low path makes it very easy to lose track of the sun position. A crystal that can pick out the hidden direction of light in such conditions feels like a gift, especially on long crossings between cold coasts. You play with the stone once more, tilting it so the light inside shifts. For a brief moment, you imagine how this scene would look to someone from a later age, used to metal instruments and digital screens. They might laugh at a crew trusting a bit of cloudy crystal. Then you picture that same person dropping a phone overboard and instantly losing a glowing map. Suddenly, the quiet confidence of people who can coax direction from cloud-locked light feels a lot more impressive. The ship keeps sliding forward under the gray lid. The sea slaps softly against the hull. Above you, the sky stays stubborn and blank. Inside, the crystal tiny movements of brightness continue to whisper where the hidden sun hangs. The longer you practice this slow, steady ritual, the more the flat, washed-out dome above stops feeling empty. It becomes another page in a book of signs written in light that you can only see when you are willing to stop, breathe, and let a small piece of stone teach your eyes a new way to look. You watch a coil of rope unroll like a pale snake across the deck, each loop slipping over the next in a soft, rasping sigh. At the end of the line waits a heavy lump of worked stone and metal shaped so it falls straight without drifting. It looks unimpressive, but everyone treats it with the same quiet respect they give the steering oar. A calm order moves along the benches, and the ship slows just enough for the line to work properly. The sail eases, the creak of wood softens, and for a moment, the hull feels as if it is listening. One of the crew lifts the weight, tests its balance, and then lets it drop cleanly over the side. It hits the surface with a tidy splash and disappears, the rope sliding after it through toughened hands. You hear the line rub against the gunwale as it runs out. The coil shrinks loop by loop. The holder lets it feed and counts quietly, not in seconds, but in arm lengths. Palm over palm, elbow to wrist, each full reach marks another measure of depth. Long before any mechanical gauge, people discover that their own bodies can serve as rulers. Once you know how many of your arm spans hang between ship and seafloor, the dark below becomes a little less mysterious. There is a solid historical fact woven into this simple act. Sailors, in many seafaring cultures, rely on sounding lines to measure depth and learn where safe water lies. Without charts or echoing instruments, the only way to know if the hull is gliding over clear depth or creeping toward a hidden shoal is to let something heavy travel down, touch the bottom, and report back through length and tension. The rope begins to slow as the weight reaches its destination. The person holding it feels for that faint slackening, that tiny relaxation that says there is no more distance to fall. Fingers close around wet strands and grip. A number is called out firm and clear over the steady hush of the sea. The meaning is not just how many body lengths of water lie below. It is also a memory trigger for every time that depth has appeared on this route before. You move closer as they haul the weight back up. When it surfaces, it carries more than seawater. A thin smear clings to its base, pale and grainy. The crew member leans in, eyebrows narrowing, and inspects it as if checking a coin for forgery. Today it looks like light sand mixed with tiny broken shells. Another time it might be sticky, mud-coarse gravel or even crumbly fragments of shell banks that crunch between fingers. A small, clever trick hides in that smear. Some sounding weights have a little hollow in their underside filled with tallow or other sticky fat. When the weight hits the seabed, grains of whatever lies down there press into the soft patch and ride back up to the deck. By feeling and looking at that sample, you can tell whether you're above a sandy approach, a muddy estuary, or a vicious stony bottom that would chew through an anchor rope given half a chance. It is like scooping a fingertip of the seafloor straight into your palm. Historians still argue whether crews on early northern voyages use this trick regularly, or whether it belongs mostly to later harbor pilots guiding bulky merchant ships through crowded, shifting channels. Some researchers imagine experienced captains happily smearing tallow on their weights and reading the mud like a letter from the deep. Others think simple depth readings, combined with memory and local guidance, might have been enough for many journeys. From the way everyone on this deck watches that returning weight, it is easy to believe that any trick which adds even a scrap of certainty would be welcome. The idea of grown adults crouching over a lump of greasy sand might sound funny at first. Someone inevitably claims that one particular harbor can be recognized by mud that smells suspiciously like wet sheep. Another boasts that he can tell which valley a certain grit came from, as if he conducts job interviews with every pebble. The teasing earns a few tired smiles, but beneath the jokes, there is real attention. The bottom of the sea is talking, and no one wants to miss what it says. The routine repeats. Line overboard. Coil slips away. Depth counted. Weight raised. Sample checked. Each sounding adds another tiny piece to an invisible picture. In your mind, the sea beneath the hull slowly stops being a blank abyss and becomes a landscape. There are underwater hills, where the depth suddenly rises long, flat stretches, where the numbers stay steady for a comforting time, and sharp slopes, where the bottom leaps upward, faster than anyone likes. You start to understand why this matters so much near coasts and river mouths. In many northern waters, dangerous sandbanks and hidden rocks lurk where tides and storms endlessly rearrange the seafloor. A channel that was safe last year may have shifted just enough to scrape a careless hull. Written notes, when they exist, age quickly. The sounding line, by contrast, is always up to date. Each drop gives fresh, local truth drawn directly from the deep. A slightly eccentric habit grows from this need for certainty. Some navigators collect small samples of seabed from important anchorages and keep them in little leather pouches or wooden boxes. A pinch of pale sand from one harbor, a lump of dark clay from another, a gritty mix of shells from a third. Before entering a tricky approach, they might compare the new smear from the weight with their tiny archive. If the texture and color match, they feel a little more sure that they are entering the place. They think they are not some confusing cousin of it. To an outsider, hoarding bits of mud and sand might look like a very dull hobby. To someone responsible for bringing a ship full of people and cargo safely home, those pouches are like a quiet reference library. Each grain represents a successful arrival and a memory of safe holding ground. The collection does not guarantee safety, but it shortens the list of surprises. As the hours pass, the rope continues to coil and uncoil, leaving faint, damp rings on the planks and stronger impressions in your mind. You begin to picture the seafloor as a set of gentle contour lines, drawn not with ink, but with repeated measurements. When the called depths fit the pattern, people expect they relax into the task. When a number wrong in ear shoulders stiffen and a second sounding quickly follows. You let your fingers brush the wet rope as it lies cooling on the deck. The fibers smell of salt and faintly of fat from the weight. Somewhere below, unseen slopes rise and fall. You cannot look through the water, but you can still learn where those slopes lie by asking a simple question and counting carefully while the answer travels back up the line into your hands. In a world without machines, this is how the hidden ground becomes part of your path, turning the dark beneath the hull into a patient guide rather than a silent threat. You wake to a different kind of movement, a slow, steady slide that feels less like climbing over separate waves and more like riding along the back of something very large that has already decided where it wants to go. The wind is not especially strong. The sky is calm. Yet, the longship keeps gliding with a quiet confidence, its bow pointing steadily into a path you did not draw on any chart. You sit up and notice how the swell leans in one preferred direction. The crests run in long, nearly parallel lines that all march the same way across the surface. Even when the wind shifts a little, the deeper rhythm stays stubborn. This is not just ordinary chop. You are sitting on an ocean current, a wide, invisible river that runs inside the sea. A simple historical fact holds you in place here. Across the North Atlantic, powerful currents flow like highways between coastlines. Warm water from lower latitudes swings north and east, meeting colder flows from the Arctic. Those moving masses do not care about human plans. They roll on year after year, bending around underwater ridges and deep basins, turning some stretches of ocean into fast lanes and others into slow corners where ships feel as if they are pulling through cold honey. You feel the hull answer that hidden road. When the ship points along the current, the planks hum with a softer vibration, and the wake stretches in one smooth line behind you. When the bow drifts even a little across the flow, you notice more splash and sideways tugging. It is like trying to walk across a crowded hallway instead of simply joining the stream of people heading in the same direction. Someone taps a toe against the deck and mutters that the sea is feeling helpful today. Another replies that this is the only kind of help you never have to repay, which earns a few bleary smiles. Sailors quickly learn where these helpful stretches live. Between long northern coasts, currents steer ships toward mid-ocean islands and onward to harsher western shores. People who have ridden these invisible roads once or twice do not forget how they feel. You watch as a floating clump of foam and seaweed drifts past. Instead of sliding straight away from the hull, it glides toward the stern, as if a great hand under the water has grabbed both ship and debris and is dragging them along together. If you drop a scrap of wood over the side, it does not sink or drift off at random. It tags along, falling behind in slow motion, but never wandering far from the same lane. Historians still argue whether crews in the early centuries think of these flows as clearly defined currents, or simply talk about fast and slow regions of sea. Whatever terms they use, practical knowledge builds up. People know that certain routes feel quicker and kinder when followed in particular seasons. One crew member, with a weary humor of someone who has pulled too many oars, calls this current a free ride for people with sore shoulders. He insists that the gods invented it after listening to one too many complaints from rowers. Another jokes that it is the only part of the sea that behaves like a generous host, pushing you toward shelter instead of away from it. Under the laughter, you hear the quiet respect in their voices. There is another clear fact written into the pattern of settlements across the northern world. People manage to reach far-flung islands and icy coasts that would be brutally hard to find by random wandering. Repeated voyages between home shores and distant colonies are not accidents stacked on top of each other. They rely on some mix of wind, sky, and water that makes certain paths more forgiving than they might seem on a flat map. You notice that even when the sail hangs a little lazy, the longship keeps moving at a steady pace. Oars dip only now and then more to keep the bow trimmed than to drag the vessel forward. The timbers creak with a relaxed rhythm rather than the tight, unhappy strain you hear when every stroke fights both wind and water. Your body learns that a good current feels almost like coasting downhill on a long, gentle slope. At the same time, you sense the trap that hides inside this gift. If you misjudge where the current bends, you can be carried past a small island or a narrow fjord mouth before you realize it. A lane that helps you reach one coast can just as easily slide you along that coast and away from your intended harbor. Navigators learn to watch for signs that they are entering or leaving a fast band of water. Foam lines tilt, driftwood changes speed, and the shape of the swell shifts under the hull. You look ahead and imagine these currents stretching between lands you have only heard about in low firelight. To the east, familiar coasts and trading towns. To the west, colder and rougher shores where farms cling to harsh ground. Between them, long ribbons of moving water do some of the work that later ages will assign to engines. There is no noise apart from waves and wind. The power comes quietly from temperature differences and planetary spin, turning the ocean into a vast, silent machine that never needs repairs. Historians still argue whether long voyages rely first on following these currents, or whether they begin as bold experiments that happen to survive because wind and water favor them. From your seat on the bench, it feels less important which came first. What matters is the way people notice, remember, and share the pattern. A route that once surprised everyone slowly hardens into an expected path, passed from helmsman to helmsman's, as if the sea has carved lanes for those willing to listen. You settle your back against a bundle of gear and feel the gentle forward pull, steady as a long breath. Without instruments or glowing maps, you can still tell that the ship rides with something larger than its own weight and sail. It is like resting your palm on the flank of a huge animal and feeling the slow, patient strength under its skin. This is how distant coasts become reachable, not by conquering the ocean with force, but by learning where it quietly offers to carry you along. You sit with your back against a shield and listen to the quiet rise and fall of voices around you. The talk on deck is low and even like a group of storytellers in a smoky hall. No one is holding a scroll. No one is sketching lines on wax. All the important directions live in heads and tongues. A rower nearby begins to recite something that sounds at first like a poem. The words come in a steady rhythm that fits neatly with the rocking of the ship. It is not about heroes striking dramatic poses. It is about a headland that looks like a sleeping dog, a bay where the sand squeaks underfoot, and a reef that chews on careless keels. By the time the speaker reaches the end, you realize that what you heard was not just entertainment. It was a string of sailing instructions wrapped in verse. There is a plain historical fact that supports this habit. In societies where writing is limited or reserved for special purposes, people store practical knowledge in stories, chants, and patterned speech. Routes across land and sea are turned into sequences that can be recited out loud. A young sailor might learn where to steer by learning a song long before they ever touch a steering oar. Another voice joins in, correcting a detail about the order of two islands. The tone is friendly but firm. Directions are treated with the same care you would give a sharp blade. A misplaced line could send an entire crew toward the wrong piece of coast. Everyone on board carries a slightly different version of the route in their head. By speaking it out loud, they smooth those versions together until one shared path emerges. You begin to pick out the structure. Short phrases tie landmarks to actions. Sail 2 days from the tall cliff, then watch for a river that stains the sea. Turn where the green hill splits into two. Keep the mountain that looks like a broken tooth on your left until the water smells of peat. The instructions do not mention numbers or angles. They rely on how far a ship usually travels in a certain wind, and on features that stand out strongly enough to be recognized under many kinds of weather. Historians still argue whether formal sea guides exist as fixed recitations with established titles or whether each crew builds its own chain of remembered places. Some argue that long narrative poems preserve fragments of real routes tucked between tales of feuds and feasts. Others think practical directions stay mostly in everyday talk, never woven into grand saga verse. From your place on the planks, the difference feels small. What matters is that words carry the map when hands are too busy to hold anything else. You notice that the spoken routes are full of comparison. A bay looks like a drinking horn when seen from the east. A reef resembles the back of a drowned ox. A jagged rock pillar appears like a finger pointing inland. These images are not chosen because they are beautiful. They are chosen because they stick inside the mind. You only need to see the drinking horn shape once before the link becomes permanent. A quirky custom reveals itself when a crew passes a new or confusing stretch of coast. Someone coins a fresh nickname for an unnamed rock or hill, usually rude, often funny. If the voyage goes well, that joke name may travel home with the crew and enter common use. Years later, people might navigate by a landmark whose formal name has been forgotten while the silly nickname survives. Somewhere a serious scholar will eventually have to accept that part of the mental atlas rests on a very old joke. You listen as one of the oldest sailors recounts a difficult passage long ago. The story begins with a familiar place and then follows a chain of mishaps. Wind that died too early, fog that rolled in too fast, currents that pulled them sideways at night until they landed under cliffs they did not recognize. The listeners lean in not for the drama, but for the moment where the storyteller describes how they found their way again. A certain smell in the air, birds climbing a particular pattern in the wind, a memory of a hill shape caught in half light. The tale is both warning and lesson. There is a steady fact about memory at work here. The human mind is much better at holding images, rhythms, and emotions than dry lists. A route tied to a story about a storm, a near miss, or a lucky landfall will stick far more stubbornly than a bare sequence of directions. That is why so many practical details hide in tales told at night. People remember where to sail because they remember who got lost, who panicked, and who noticed the small sign that saved them. You begin to sense that every person on board is a small map. One sailor remembers the feel of a cross current in a certain channel. Another remembers the smell of smoke from a settlement that always burns seaweed in spring. Someone else remembers the color of a cliff that looks black at noon and red at sunset. When they speak together, those fragments overlap. The result is a chart that no single person ever holds completely, yet the crew carries as a group. At night, when the work eases, these memories are polished into better stories. A difficult harbor entrance becomes a tale about a boastful helmsman humbled by hidden rocks. A lucky landfall after days of fog becomes a quiet tribute to the watchful rower who spotted a line of foam and trusted it. Jokes grow around mistakes, which makes the mistakes harder to repeat. Praise grows around good judgment, which makes those choices easier to copy. You let your eyes close while the voices continue to rise and fall. In your drowsy mind, the words turn into a long, winding path that loops from headland to headland and from island to island. There is no ink No paper and no compass, yet the route feels solid. You could almost walk along it with bare feet if someone could lay it out on a beach. Out here, surrounded by water, that invisible path lives in breath and memory. As long as people keep telling it, the ship can find its way across wide, empty stretches of sea that would otherwise feel like roadless wilderness. You watch the sky with the wary attention you might give a moody friend. It has been pleasant enough for most of the day, pale and calm, but now the clouds begin to rearrange themselves into something more complicated. Thin streaks slide high above like scratches on glass, while lower shapes puff and darken near the horizon. The sea still feels cooperative, yet everyone is looking up more often than down. You start to see why so many hours at sea are spent simply staring at clouds. One clear historical fact stands above the rest here. In the northern Atlantic, storms can arrive quickly and hit hard, and people learn over generations which cloud patterns usually mean harmless wind and which ones mean trouble. Long, wispy veils around the sun can hint at moisture building high in the sky. Tall stacks of cloud with dark bellies growing faster than your nerves, like usually point toward rough air and restless waves. Someone points out a faint ring around the sun, a halo that looks like an accidental circle drawn by a clumsy hand. The crew member mutters that light rings mean the weather is plotting something. The explanation hides in the tiny ice crystals drifting high above, bending the sunlight and hinting at incoming fronts. You do not need to know the science to feel your shoulders tighten when the ring appears. It is the sky's way of clearing its throat before speaking more loudly. Historians still argue whether specific sayings about these signs are widely shared among long-distance crews or mostly confined to local fishing people who spend every day under the same patch of sky. Either way, the ship you are on has collected its own private catalog of rules. Greenish light under thick cloud before dusk often means heavy rain. Sudden lines of low, fast-moving clouds can announce a shift in wind that will either help or torment you. As evening creeps in, the western sky catches your eye. Bands of deeper red and orange streak along the horizon, glowing beneath the darker roof of cloud. A quietly optimistic murmur circles the deck. Many cultures pick up versions of the idea that a red sky at night often precedes good weather, while a red sky in the morning can warn of rough conditions brewing. Out here, far from land, that rhyme is less a charming proverb and more a cautious bet placed on the next day. You notice another stranger habit. One of the older sailors sniffs the air, then nods to himself as if the breeze has just delivered a private letter. He claims that very cold, dry wind with a metallic tang means clear weather, while warmer gusts that feel almost sticky often go ahead of wet storms. No one pretends this method is perfect, but noses have plenty of time to practice. You laugh at the idea of forecasting with your face, then slowly realize you have been doing something similar already, checking how different winds feel on your skin. There is a quirky bit of weather lore that makes you smile. A small wooden charm hangs from the rigging, carved like a plump little figure with its tongue sticking out. Some crew members swear that turning the charm so it looks inland rather than out to sea will discourage storms from marching over the horizon. Others tease that this only works if you also swear never to brag about the weather being safe. The charm does not exactly control the sky, but it gives nervous hands something to adjust when clouds begin stacking in unsettling ways. Beyond daily signs, the bigger pattern of seasons shapes every choice about when to sail and when to stay ashore. In the far north winter sea, travel is dangerous and generally avoided. Short daylight ice forming along coasts and frequent storms make the risk far less attractive than the reward. A solid fact about long voyages is that they tend to cluster in milder months when ice retreats and there are enough hours of halfway reliable light to watch the horizon. You watch the length of the day change as weeks pass. In early season, dawn lingers and dusk arrives reluctantly, giving you long stretches in which the sun or stars can guide you. Later, as the year leans toward colder times, mornings feel reluctant and evenings hurry in tightening the window for safe travel. People mark these shifts not with printed calendars, but with keen observation. When the sun sets beyond certain points along local hills, when shadows at midday grow longer than a person lying on the deck, those details quietly tell sailors that their open sea time is shrinking. Historians still argue whether crews rely mainly on this gradual feel for changing light or whether they also use rough counts of days tied to important gatherings, such as seasonal markets and assemblies. Some argue that voyagers aim to leave shortly after big social events carrying news and goods along with them. Others think practical matters like food stores, livestock cycles, and family needs dictate the schedule more than any fixed plan. From your seat on the ship, it seems that all these influences blend together until the timing of departure feels both traditional and pragmatic. You see how risk is never fully separate from routine. Before setting out, people weigh more than just distance. They consider how late in the season the storms usually strengthen, how cold currents creep in, how early sea ice might grow teeth along the routes. Good years and bad years blur into a memory of averages. If the last few summers have been gentle, some may grow bold and push their luck longer. If recent winters have bitten early, caution becomes more fashionable. One sailor explains with the patient tone of someone who has watched newcomers make poor choices that a wise crew respects 3 clocks at once. The first clock is the wind, which can change in an hour. The second is the sky, which often hints a day or two ahead if you know how to read it. The third is the year itself, slowly tipping from safe water to dangerous. You cannot argue with any of those clocks, he says. You can only decide how late you are willing to leave the house. You imagine a map of these seas draped over a map of seasons. Certain paths glow bright during calm months and fade almost completely during rough ones. A gentle current that feels like a helpful push in midsummer becomes a conveyor belt toward ice and storms by late autumn. Villages along the coast watch the pattern too. They know which weeks are most likely to bring visiting ships and which weeks leave their harbors empty and their people staring at the horizon with a different sort of worry. As you huddle deeper into your cloak and watch the last color drip from the clouds, you realize that navigation here has never been just about finding direction. It has always been about choosing when to trust the sea with your weight. Clouds, winds, colors, and creeping darkness are all part of that conversation. There is no single moment when it becomes safe. There is only a sliding scale between prudence and boldness, and every journey is an answer to the same quiet question that the horizon keeps asking: is today worth the risk? You blink against the salt air and the creak of planks slowly blends into a different kind of wood smell and a different harbor. The water is still there, the sky is still huge, yet the shore carries cranes, piers, and unfamiliar buildings. A long, lean ship sits tied alongside its hull, fresh and dark dragon head, sharp and bright, as if it just left a carver's hands. This is a reconstruction built plank by plank from old finds dug out of burial mounds and peat soil then tested to see whether ancient ideas still float. You walk along the quay and reach out to touch the side of the vessel. The planks are overlapping, fastened with iron and wooden pegs, just as archaeologists found them in famous ship graves. There is a clear historical fact behind this hull. Real longships have been uncovered at places in Scandinavia and carefully recorded length, beam, number of oar holes, mast, step, even tiny tool marks. Shipwrights study that evidence and then try to bring it alive again, not as a museum statue, but as a living, moving experiment. A crew in bright, modern, waterproof clothing clambers on board. Life jackets hang ready. Someone wears a woolen cap that would not look out of place in any century. Another person carries a small notebook already smudged with sea stains. The plan is simple. Take this ship out across real water use, only the tools that would have been available in the distant past, and see how far those methods can actually carry you. You step over the rail and feel the same long, narrow deck under your feet. The benches wait along the sides, oars resting in their places. The mast stands tall over the central walkway, its yard ready to carry the square sail. Modern harbor noise hums around you, yet as soon as the mooring lines are slipped and the hull begins to move, the sounds fade into the background. You are back to the creak of timber and the hush of waves tapping against the sides. The project leader calls for the first trial. No compass, no electronic devices, no glowing screens. They will rely on Sunstar's waves wind in the shape of the coastline, just as crews once did. A modern escort boat lurks in the distance for safety, but its instruments stay out of sight. On this deck, the only guides are human senses and whatever simple tools can be built from wood, rope, and stone. The sail fills and the ship leans into its course. Very quickly you feel how slender and flexible this hull really is. It rises cleanly over short waves and keeps gliding. The oar, when used, bite into the water with a smooth, light stroke. People on land once doubted that such ships could cross open ocean without falling apart, yet each experiment at sea adds weight to the idea that they are far tougher and more agile than they appear on a museum floor. One quirky test emerges when the crew decides to follow a route that was only described in an old saga. The text mentions sailing a certain number of days along a coast, turning when a particular island shape appears, and then riding a current toward a new land. The details are vague to a modern eye. No latitude. No neat coordinates. Only time, wind, and a few landmarks. Still, the crew sets out to see how close they can come using that kind of description. You help hold a simple wooden board while someone uses a short stick to follow the movement of the sun. The ship keeps to a chosen bearing by watching the shadow edge, just as earlier navigators might have done when the sky cooperates. Later, when clouds hide the light, one of the researchers pulls out a crystal-shaped sunstone and tries to find the hidden position of the sun through the gray. Another uses the height of the central star at night to check latitude. Everyone notes how easy it is to lose focus when tired and cold, and how important steady practice becomes out here. Historians still argue whether these reconstructed methods truly match what early crews used, or whether modern tests accidentally mix old fragments with fresh guesswork. From where you stand on the moving deck, the debate feels oddly gentle. The point is less to declare a final answer and more to discover which combinations of skills actually keep a ship on track when the sea decides to challenge patience and nerve. On some voyages, the reconstructed ships cross hundreds of miles using almost nothing beyond sunstars and currents, then arrive surprisingly close to their intended destination. That success does not prove that every voyage in history followed the same pattern, but it shows that such travel is physically possible. Writers who once joked that ancient sailors must have just muddled through with luck start to sound a little quieter after reading logs from these trial runs. The crew learns practical lessons that do not always appear in tidy articles. For example, holding a steady course by starlight sounds noble until you discover how quickly your neck complains from staring up while the deck tilts. Keeping a mental count of days at sea seems simple until fog sits over the water and sleep grows thin. People quickly realize why songs, chants, and shared stories may have mattered so much. They keep minds alert and link directions to words that can be repeated when brains feel foggier than the air. There is a moment during one night watch when you stand by the steering oar next to a modern helmsman who has promised to avoid looking at electronics. The sky is clear, the sea just restless enough to keep everyone honest. The person at your side points to the central star, checks the angle of the sail, and listens to the long hum of the swell under the hull. With only those senses, they keep the ship moving along a steady path, hour after hour. When they later compare that course with the track recorded secretly by instruments on the escort boat, the difference is small enough to feel both humbling and reassuring. A visiting journalist on one of these experimental trips earns a quiet nickname after becoming seasick while trying to take notes. Between bouts of regret over the side, they admit that nothing in a library fully prepared them for standing in the dark, trusting a low wooden shell, and hoping that the stars really do mean what theory says. The crew offers them dry bread and sympathetic smiles. No one is immune to the reality that every elegant navigation idea still has to survive rolling waves, cold air, and tired eyes. By the end of a long passage, the logbooks begin to fill with practical observations. Were certain currents pushed harder than expected? How far a steady wind can move the ship in one day when the sail stays trimmed just right? Which cloud patterns matched changing weather and which turned out to be empty worry? The notes read like a conversation between present and past. Ancient ship forms and fragments of old knowledge meet modern measurement and patient trial. The dialogue does not end any argument completely yet. It makes casual dismissal much harder. You lean on the rail as the reconstructed ship glides toward a safe harbor, its dragon head still watching the waves with carved patience. Behind you, the wake glows faintly in evening light. A headland waits with its harbors and questions. The experiments are not perfect. No reconstruction can ever restore every detail of a vanished world. Even so, each successful crossing under these conditions whispers that the sea once carried many such hulls along similar paths, guided by skywater and human attention, rather than by metal needles and glowing screens. You sit on the narrow bench while night gathers around the hull, and the feeling in your chest is softer than before. Water and sky seem calmer in your thoughts, as if they have accepted your presence and are willing to guide you in the direction you hope to go. The sail holds a gentle curve. The oars lie in place, ready but resting. Above you, stars appear in the deepening blue, bright and clean in the clear air. The steady guiding star hangs where you expect it, a fixed point among slow-wheeling patterns. Your eyes find it without effort, the way they find familiar objects in your room in the half-light. A simple, historical fact lives inside this quiet scene. Crews from northern coasts manage not only to reach far islands and colder western shores, but also to return often enough to build lasting settlements and regular routes. The pattern of artifacts spread along those lands, from tools to house, remains to buried hulls, points to repeated crossings that succeed often enough for people to treat them as part of ordinary life You feel the swell under the hull, pressing in one clear direction, a long, slow push that hints at a helpful current doing some of the carrying. The wind touches your cheek from a familiar quarter. The air has a faint green edge that suggests distant land, even though water still runs to every horizon. Together, these small signs wrap around you and give your tired thoughts less to argue with. A crew member near you stretches yawns and begins humming a low tune that has no words. It does not list headlands or reefs. It simply matches the rhythm of the ship as it moves. Another person plays with a small charm carved from driftwood and says the vessel prefers this direction, as if the planks have a favorite path across the sea. The idea is playful and strange, yet it fits the sense that some ways across the water feel right in your bones. Historians still argue whether this feeling grows only from long practice and pattern recognition, or whether sailors also lean on ideas about luck and personality in their ships to stay calm through long crossings. Whatever the balance, you notice the difference between anxious watching and the easier attention that comes when wind, wave, and sky all behave as expected. The sky darkens further, and the constellations draw their slow arcs from one edge of the world to the other. Certain groups of stars rise from the same low-zone climb and sink toward another, making quiet tracks that your mind begins to follow. You know that if you had to, you point roughly toward home with your eyes closed, simply by remembering how these lights usually move on nights like this. Near the prow, a small box sits under a coil of rope. Inside are modest things left by crew members, over time private tokens tucked into a shared space. A coin that once paid for bread, a scrap of cloth from a cloak that finally wore through, a tiny carving of a land bird that dislikes open water. These objects are not payments in any strict sense. They are small acknowledgments that some parts of a journey rest beyond planning. As the hours pass, the deck cools and your muscles soften. You start to notice your own breathing more than the movement of the ship. The long glide of the hull becomes a gentle background, like a slow drum far away. Around you, cloaks rustle as people shift into more comfortable shapes, trusting their companions to stay alert when needed. You let your shoulders loosen and feel yourself settling more heavily against the bench. The cool touch of the plank beneath you feels firm and safe. Air moves across your face in slow breaths, almost like a hand smoothing the last busy thoughts from your forehead. Each time you breathe in, you draw in the quiet of the open sea. Each time you breathe out, you let go of one more fragment of noise from your day. The sounds around you are simple. Water sliding along the hull in long strokes. The faint creak of rope that has found a comfortable pull. The occasional shift of a foot or a shield, followed by stillness again. With every small sound, you feel a little more distance from bright rooms and fast conversations, as if you are stepping deeper into a space where the only task is to rest. You notice that the dark above is not empty. It is filled with soft light and very slow movement. Stars that burned long before any shipbuilder shaped a plank continue to look down on this thin strip of wood and wool. Their glow is quiet and steady. It does not ask anything of you. With your eyes half closed, you can picture a safe shore somewhere ahead. It does not need sharp detail. It can be just a low band of darker shadow with a few warm lights behind it, a place where hull and crew will eventually stop and people will walk on steady ground again. Knowing that such a place exists is enough for now. You do not have to arrive there in this moment. You only have to trust that you are already moving in that direction. Your breathing slows to match the roll of the ship. In through the nose as the bow rises, out through the mouth as the hull settles. Each easy cycle loosens something inside you, jaw softening, neck relaxing, hands easing their grip on cloak or bench. You feel as if you are sinking into a deep, quiet bed made of night air and gentle water. If random thoughts try to surge in, you can let them pass by like scraps of driftwood on the surface. You do not have to follow them or pick them up. You can simply watch them slide away while the longship keeps its calm course. The details of directions, winds, currents, and stars can look after themselves now. All that remains is the rocking of the hull, the hush of the sea, and the growing weight of your own body as it drifts toward sleep. You are carried. You are held. You are already on the way home.